there was an address in America where art hung on walls that witnessed ruin, where a private gambling club disguised itself as a museum, where masterworks in gilded frames provided cover for cash that moved through velvet-lined rooms at rates that would have horrified the artists who painted them. The building looked respectable from the street, a dignified townhouse on a block where wealthy men lived and worked. But step through its doors after being assessed and admitted, and you entered a world designed with surgical precision, beauty deployed as camouflage, luxury weaponized as legitimacy, culture performing the role of alibi, while fortunes changed hands in games the law had forbidden, but power had permitted. This was not a crude gambling den. There were no garish signs, no visible vice, no atmosphere of desperation. What made this place dangerous was exactly its refinement. The proprietor understood that powerful men would pay premium rates for the privilege of losing money in surroundings that suggested they were doing something elevated rather than illegal. The art collection genuine masterworks acquired at considerable expense transformed rooms where men gambled into galleries, where cultured patrons happened to play cards. The distinction mattered legally, socially, and financially. For years, the operation functioned under a conspiracy of silence, maintained through mutual interest. The patrons needed a place where they could indulge expensive vice without social consequence. The proprietor needed their continued patronage and the protection their influence provided. The political machine needed the revenue that flowed from protection payments. And the art world, when the collection was finally liquidated, needed not to ask too many questions about how a gambling operator had acquired works that now hang in museums with labels that mention previous owners, but rarely specify what those owners actually did. The club rose because it understood that luxury could make vice invisible. It fell when reform made visibility unavoidable, and it vanished so completely that the primary evidence of its existence is scattered across galleries and auction houses, beautiful objects that once served a purpose their current custodians prefer not to examine too closely. In the final decade of the 19th century, American cities developed a particular form of hypocrisy about vice. Gambling was illegal. This was clear in statute, unambiguous in law. But enforcement was selective, negotiable, a matter of politics rather than justice. Public gambling houses, the crude establishments where working men lost wages, were raided with theatrical regularity, their operators arrested, their customers sometimes shamed in newspapers that served moral reform. But private clubs, where wealthy men gambled, operated under different rules, or rather, under the understanding that rules applied differently to those who could afford discretion and pay for protection. The distinction was geographic as much as economic. Certain neighborhoods in major cities became known, quietly, as places where the wealthy could pursue pleasures that were officially forbidden. These were not vice districts in any obvious sense. No red lights, no visible solicitation, no open acknowledgement of what happened behind closed doors. These were respectable streets, lined with townhouses that looked like private residences, where businesses operated without signs, where access was controlled by recognition rather than advertisement. The city's power structure facilitated this arrangement through mechanisms that were never documented, but thoroughly understood. Police precincts knew which establishments were protected and which were not. Political machines received contributions that bought not just protection, but advance warning of any reform pressure that might threaten operations. Judges who heard cases involving protected establishments understood that certain outcomes were expected. The system worked because everyone with influence benefited from it. The operators made money, the politicians received contributions, the police supplemented official salaries, and the patrons got what they wanted without social consequences. But this arrangement required constant maintenance. Protection had to be purchased repeatedly. Relationships had to be cultivated. Political changes had to be navigated. An operator who fell behind on payments or offended the wrong official could find protection evaporating overnight. A patron whose presence became embarrassing. Through scandal or financial collapse or political opposition, could be quietly excluded. The system was stable only as long as everyone understood their role and performed it reliably. The clubs that survived longest were those that understood luxury was itself a form of protection. A crude gambling house could be raided without political cost. Reformers would celebrate, newspapers would approve, and no important interests would be damaged. But a club that served as social hub for powerful men, that functioned as unofficial gathering place for political and financial decision-makers, that looked and felt like the kind of establishment respectable people might patronize, such a place was harder to touch. Raiding it meant embarrassing people who could retaliate, exposing relationships that everyone preferred to keep private, creating records that implicated networks extending far beyond the club itself. And so the most successful operations built themselves to look like something other than what they were. Not gambling houses, but social clubs. Not vice establishments, but gathering places for refined men who happened to play cards. The fiction was maintained through aesthetics, through the careful construction of environments that suggested culture and elevation rather than mere indulgence. The luxury was not decoration, it was infrastructure, essential to the operation's survival. Geography reinforced this protection. The right address suggested legitimacy, the right neighbors provided cover, the right location meant proximity to power, physically close to the men whose presence and patronage made the operation valuable, positioned where it could serve as convenient gathering place for those whose schedules and interests required discretion. The club existed where it did not by accident, but by strategic calculation about where vice could operate while appearing to be something else entirely. The proprietor who built the club understood that in America's cities, the most profitable vice was that which felt least like vice at all. His origins were modest, but not desperate middle class, educated enough to understand how power worked, but not positioned to wield it through inheritance or connection. He learned early that money moved through spaces that were carefully designed and ruthlessly managed, that comfort and discretion could be sold at premium prices to men who had everything except privacy to indulge their expensive habits. He worked in legitimate establishments, first hotels, restaurants, private clubs, learning how service worked, how staffing was managed, how atmosphere was created and maintained. But he recognized that legitimate operations had limitations. The margins were thin, the competition intense, the opportunities for building real wealth constrained by regulation and overhead. The real money, he understood, was in providing what people wanted but could not obtain legally, and doing so in ways that made the illegality invisible or at least deniable. Not crude vice that attracted attention and required constant negotiation with authorities, but refined vice that looked like culture, that could be defended as social gathering rather than commercial gambling. His breakthrough came through observation rather than innovation. He noticed that wealthy men who gambled wanted not just the game but the environment. They would pay more to lose money in surroundings that felt exclusive, that suggested they were engaging in sophisticated entertainment rather than illegal gambling. They wanted beauty, comfort, service, and above all, discretion. They wanted a place that looked nothing like the gambling houses that reformers raided, that felt instead like the private clubs they already belonged to, where the presence of other wealthy men legitimized whatever happened inside. He began small, testing the concept in spaces he rented rather than owned, learning what worked and what attracted unwanted attention. he discovered that the key was selection. Not advertising to bring in anyone willing to pay, but screening to ensure only the right people entered. This required developing systems for identifying acceptable patrons, for communicating access without obvious solicitation, for building trust among men who needed assurance that their presence would never become public knowledge. He also learned the darker skills that made such an operation sustainable. How to identify which police officials controlled enforcement in specific neighborhoods. How to structure payments to look like legitimate business expenses. How to cultivate relationships with political operatives who could provide advance warning of reform pressure. How to keep books that would satisfy authorities if examined while hiding the actual scope of operations. He became expert at the machinery of corruption, understanding it not as criminal enterprise, but as business requiring specific skills in relationship management and risk assessment. What made him dangerous was not ruthlessness, but competence. He was not a thug imposing himself through violence, but a businessman building an operation through careful calculation. He understood that the most successful vice operations were those that looked least like vice, that served clients who would never patronize an obvious gambling house, that operated with enough sophistication to make closure politically complicated. He was building not just a club, but a system one that would require more than simple law enforcement to dismantle. His obsession was not wealth for its own sake, but the creation of something perfect, an operation so well designed, so carefully protected, so thoroughly legitimate in appearance that it could operate indefinitely without consequence. He wanted to build a club that powerful men would defend, because closing it would be more inconvenient than allowing it to continue. And he understood that achieving this required not just good service, but extraordinary aesthetics, an environment so beautiful and refined that its existence seemed to elevate rather than corrupt those who entered it. The art collection was key to this vision, not decoration, but strategy, not luxury for luxury's sake, but luxury as insurance. The formative crisis came early, when his first significant operation was raided during a reform crackdown. The club had been operating successfully for months, generating substantial revenue, building a loyal clientele of wealthy patrons who appreciated the discretion and quality of service. But political winds shifted. A reform candidate won an election. A new district attorney took office with promises to crack down on vice, and suddenly the protection he had been paying for evaporated. The raid came without warning, coordinated to catch maximum number of patrons on site, designed to generate headlines about corruption and illegal gambling. The consequences were severe. The operation was closed, the furnishings seized, several patrons were named in newspaper accounts that damaged their reputations and his credibility. He faced charges that could have resulted in imprisonment, navigated hearings where prosecutors painted him as purveyor of vice corrupting wealthy men who should have known better. His network of protection had collapsed, and he discovered that the relationships he thought were secure were actually conditional on political circumstances beyond his control. But he also learned crucial lessons from the failure. The raid had succeeded because the operation looked like what it was, a gambling house that happened to serve wealthy clientele. The aesthetic had been comfortable, but not remarkable. The atmosphere pleasant, but not distinguished enough to make closure politically costly. The patrons, when exposed, had been embarrassed rather than outraged, treating the episode as unfortunate, but not tragic, moving on to other venues rather than defending the establishment they had frequented. The prosecution ultimately failed. His lawyers secured favorable outcomes through connections and technical defenses. Charges were reduced or dismissed, and he avoided prison. But the experience taught him that survival required more than protection payments and political connections. It required building operations that were genuinely difficult to close, that served functions beyond simple vice, that created sufficient value for important patrons that they would resist rather than accept closure. He studied clubs that had survived similar pressures and identified patterns. The establishments that endured were those that looked least like gambling houses and most like legitimate social clubs. They had distinguished addresses, refined interiors, clientele that included men whose names provided cover rather than scandal. They operated with discretion that extended beyond simply not advertising. They created environments where the gambling felt secondary to the social gathering, where patrons could tell themselves they were attending a club that happened to allow cards rather than visiting a gambling house that pretended to be a club. Most importantly, these successful operations had developed relationships with their patrons that went beyond simple business. They served as gathering places where deals were made, where political alliances were formed, where information was exchanged that had value beyond the gambling itself. Closing such a club meant disrupting networks that served broader purposes, which made authorities hesitant and gave patrons motivation to intervene on the operation's behalf. From this analysis came his big idea. Build not just a better gambling club, but a club so beautiful, so refined, so genuinely valuable as gathering place for powerful men that it transcended its illegal function. Make the gambling almost incidental to the atmosphere. Surround it with culture and beauty that suggested elevation rather than vice. Create a place that patrons would fight to preserve, not because they needed somewhere to gamble. There were other options, but because this particular place made them feel like the kind of men who belonged in galleries and museums while happening to play cards. The art collection would be the mechanism. Real artworks, properly curated, expensive enough to be credible, beautiful enough to transform the atmosphere. The club would become a gallery that allowed gambling rather than a gambling house that displayed art. And this distinction, though subtle, would be legally and socially significant, providing cover for patrons, complicating prosecution, creating legitimate cultural function that made the operation harder to characterize as simple vice. The formative failure had taught him that survival required transformation, and transformation required luxury deployed with strategic precision. The product the club offered was not gambling. Gambling was available elsewhere, often at better odds. What the club sold was permission. Permission to gamble without embarrassment, without social consequence, without fear that your presence would become public knowledge or damage your reputation. Permission to indulge vice while feeling cultured rather than corrupt, elevated rather than degenerate. Permission to lose extraordinary sums in surroundings beautiful enough to make the loss feel like sophisticated entertainment rather than compulsive behavior. This permission was valuable because it was scarce. There were many places in the city where wealthy men could gamble, but few where they could do so while maintaining their self-image as refined individuals whose habits were consistent with their social position. The club provided exactly this, an environment where illegal activity felt like legitimate social gathering, where vice was camouflaged by culture, where the presence of genuine art suggested that whatever else was happening, the patrons were at least engaging with beauty. The mechanism was psychological. Men who might feel shame about visiting an obvious gambling house felt no such shame about attending a club that happened to allow cards in rooms hung with museum-quality paintings. The aesthetic transformed the experience from something potentially degrading into something that could be defended as sophisticated recreation. When asked where they had been, patrons could truthfully say they had spent the evening at a private club viewing an impressive art collection. The gambling became a detail rather than the point. This transformation created willingness to pay premium rates. The house odds were not notably favorable. If anything, they were slightly worse than other establishments. But patrons paid without complaint because what they were purchasing was not favorable odds, but the complete package. Service, discretion, beauty, and the social legitimacy that came from gambling in a gallery rather than a den. The premium was not for the game, but for the setting, and the setting was worth whatever it cost to maintain the illusion that they were doing something refined. The product also included insurance. By creating a club that powerful men valued and defended, the proprietor built protection that went beyond simple payoffs to police and politicians. The patrons themselves became invested in the club's survival because closure would deprive them not just of a convenient gambling venue, but of a social space they had come to rely on. Some used it for business meetings, others for political coordination. Still others simply valued the atmosphere and the company. These multiple functions made the club harder to close than a simple gambling house. Shutting it down meant disrupting networks that served purposes authorities might not want to disrupt. And finally, the product included plausible deniability. If raided or investigated, the club's appearance provided defense. It looked like a legitimate social club. The art collection was genuine. The membership was exclusive, but not explicitly criminal. Individual patrons could claim they had been unaware of gambling or had assumed it was legal in this context. The proprietor could argue he ran a club that allowed games among consenting adults, that the artwork demonstrated cultural purpose, that any gambling was incidental to the broader social function. These defenses might not convince prosecutors, but they complicated prosecution enough to make it less attractive than targeting obvious vice operations. What elites paid for, ultimately, was the transformation of an illegal activity into something that felt acceptable. The club did not make gambling legal. It made it look and feel like something other than gambling, something that wealthy men could engage in without violating their self-concept as respectable citizens who happened to enjoy sophisticated entertainment. The luxury was not decoration, it was the product itself, the mechanism by which vice became invisible. The building the proprietor selected was positioned for discretion without isolation. Located on a street where private clubs and wealthy residences were common, the townhouse appeared from the outside to be exactly what its neighbors were: a well-maintained property occupied by people of means conducting business or living that required no public attention. There was no sign announcing its purpose, no visible indication that inside, something different than what appeared was occurring. The doorway was distinguished but not remarkable. The windows were curtained, but not blocked. The overall impression was of quiet prosperity rather than hidden activity. The entrance procedure began on the street. A potential patron approaching the door would be observed before arrival, doorman positioned to see who approached, assess whether they should be admitted, signal to interior staff about who was coming. This observation was invisible to those being observed, performed through windows and sight lines designed to give staff information advantage. By the time someone reached the door, decisions had been made about whether they would be admitted, and the greeting they received communicated that decision without requiring explicit rejection. Once admitted, patrons entered a space designed to feel like a wealthy home's entrance hall rather than a commercial establishment. Polished wood floors, elegant lighting, furnishings that suggested taste and permanence. But immediately visible, and this was crucial, were paintings, not prints or reproductions, but genuine artworks, properly framed and lit, works by artists whose names would be recognized by anyone with cultural knowledge. The immediate impression was that whatever else this place might be, it was somewhere that valued and displayed real art. Beyond the entrance hall, the building was organized to serve multiple functions while maintaining atmosphere. The ground floor featured a dining room where patrons could take meals prepared by a capable kitchen, served with quality wine, and surroundings that emphasized the social aspect of gathering. The dining was not incidental. It provided legitimate purpose for being on premises, created natural rhythm to evenings that might last many hours, and established that this was a club where culture and conversation mattered as much as cards. The gaming rooms were upstairs, reached via a staircase lined with paintings that continued the gallery aesthetic. These rooms were designed with careful attention to psychological detail, tables positioned to provide some privacy without isolation, lighting bright enough for play, but not harsh, seating comfortable enough for extended sessions. And everywhere, on every wall, artwork that caught the eye and created ambiance that distinguished these rooms from any mere gambling house. Patrons played cards beneath Renaissance paintings, placed bets while surrounded by landscapes from masters, experienced their wins and losses in rooms that looked like museum galleries. The staff who managed these rooms were professionals recruited from legitimate clubs and trained in discretion that went beyond simply not discussing what they saw. They were instructed to treat all patrons with identical courtesy, to show no reaction to wins or losses, to manage the technical aspects of games without engaging emotionally with outcomes. Their professionalism created atmosphere of normalcy. Whatever sums changed hands, however dramatic the wins or crushing the losses, the staff's composure suggested this was all routine, all acceptable, nothing to be ashamed of or concerned about. The building also featured practical infrastructure that supported its illicit function. A rear entrance that allowed discreet departure for patrons who preferred not to exit through the main door. A system of bells and signals that could communicate warnings from the door to the gaming rooms if unexpected visitors arrived. Storage areas where cash was held in safes that could be quickly locked if authorities appeared. An office where the proprietor managed books that tracked the operation's economics while maintaining appearance of legitimate club accounting. But the defining feature, the element that transformed the space from comfortable club into something remarkable, was the art collection itself. The proprietor had invested heavily in acquiring works that were genuinely valuable. Not unknown pieces, but paintings by recognized artists, works that could be authenticated and that would be coveted by legitimate collectors. The collection served multiple purposes simultaneously. It created the aesthetic atmosphere essential to the operation's identity. It represented capital that could be liquidated if necessary, and it provided documentary evidence of cultural purpose that complicated any characterization of the club as mere vice establishment. Every detail of the building served the operation's needs, while maintaining the fiction that this was primarily a social club with cultural interests that happened to allow gambling rather than a gambling operation disguising itself as culture. The luxury was infrastructure, carefully designed to make illegal activity feel acceptable, to transform vice into something that looked like sophisticated recreation. The club operated according to rules that were never written, but ruthlessly enforced. Access began with screening that happened before potential patrons reached the door. The proprietor built a network of current members who could vouch for new candidates, creating a system where admission required someone already trusted to assert that the candidate could be trusted as well. This vouching carried weight because members understood that bringing someone who created problems, who proved indiscreet, who gambled beyond their means and created scandal, who brought law enforcement attention, would result in the sponsor losing their own access. The system made every member an enforcer of standards. Once admitted, patrons learned through observation rather than explicit instruction. No one explained the rules. You were expected to understand them through attention to how others behaved. You observed when it was appropriate to gamble and when it was appropriate to simply dine and socialize. You noted who spoke to whom and understood that certain business discussions were welcome while others were inappropriate. You learned that losses were absorbed with grace rather than complaint, that wins were acknowledged modestly rather than celebrated loudly, that everything about the club's operation was treated as unremarkable rather than as scandal requiring secrecy. The most important rule, the one that made everything else possible, was silence about the club's existence. Not enforced through threats, but through mutual interest. Every patron benefited from discretion. If the club became public knowledge, if its operation was exposed, everyone's presence there would be embarrassing or worse. And so silence was maintained, not because the proprietor demanded it, but because every patron understood that their own reputation depended on others maintaining the same silence about them. The conspiracy required no coordination because the incentives were perfectly aligned. Contemporary accounts from former staff, recorded years later when the club was gone and confidentiality no longer mattered, describe the operation with a mix of admiration and unease. The professionalism was extraordinary. Staff were trained to standards that exceeded most legitimate establishments, paid well enough to make employment valuable, and managed with discipline that made deviation costly. But staff also described the operation's fundamental dishonesty, the gap between what the club appeared to be and what it actually was, the discomfort of maintaining fiction that transformed illegal activity into something that looked culturally valuable. One former dealer described a night when a prominent businessman lost a sum equivalent to multiple years of working wages, lost it over several hours of play, watched the money move away from him with expressions that shifted from confidence to concern to barely contained desperation, and then stood and thanked the house for the evening as if he had enjoyed himself rather than experienced financial catastrophe. The dealer remembered thinking that this was what the luxury purchased, the ability to ruin yourself in surroundings beautiful enough that the ruin felt like sophisticated misfortune rather than compulsive self-destruction. Another account describes the proprietor's personal management style. He was present most evenings, moving through rooms with attention to detail that ensured standards were maintained. He noticed when lighting needed adjustment, when a painting needed dusting, when a staff member was not performing to expectations. But he also noticed when a patron was losing too heavily, when someone's behavior suggested they were gambling beyond their means, when situations were developing that might create problems. In these cases, he would intervene subtly, suggesting the patron take a break for dinner, offering conversation that drew them away from tables, in extreme cases, quietly suggesting they depart for the evening. This management prevented the kind of spectacular losses that might generate scandal or destroy patrons whose continued patronage was valuable. Money moved through the club with systems designed to leave minimal documentation. Patrons established accounts, called credit arrangements, but functioning more like running tabs that allowed them to gamble without handling cash directly. Winnings and losses were recorded in books that the club maintained, settled periodically through discrete transfers that left no obvious connection to gambling. This system served multiple purposes. It made the gambling itself feel more abstract and thus easier to engage in. It created records the club could destroy if necessary, and it prevented the kind of cash flows that might attract attention from authorities or create paper trails that could be followed by investigators. The machine worked because every participant understood their role and performed it reliably. The staff maintained discretion and professionalism. The patrons maintained silence and paid their debts. The protection network maintained political cover and advance warning of threats. The proprietor maintained the atmosphere and managed risks that might disrupt operations. And the art collection maintained the fiction that tied everything together, the suggestion that this was not vice but culture, not exploitation but sophisticated entertainment, not something to be ashamed of, but something that elevated those who participated in it. But the machine had a vulnerability. It depended on secrecy that required broad consensus. And consensus, once broken, could not be restored through any mechanism the proprietor controlled. The peak arrived on an evening when the club felt most secure in its immunity from consequence. The season was height of winter social calendar, when wealthy men who had made fortunes during the year's business sought entertainment and the release that came from risking those fortunes in games with uncertain outcomes. The club had been operating successfully for years, had survived minor scares and political changes, had built such solid relationships with patrons and protectors that closure seemed not merely unlikely, but impossible. The proprietor had achieved what he set out to build, an operation that appeared permanent, that felt essential to its patrons, that operated with impunity, that made its illegal status seem irrelevant. The evening began as others had. Carriages arrived between 7 and 9, depositing patrons who were admitted after the customary assessment at the door. The dining room filled with men whose names appeared regularly in newspapers for their business accomplishments, whose decisions affected markets and industries, whose political connections made them seem untouchable by ordinary enforcement mechanisms. They dined on food prepared to standards that matched expensive restaurants, drank wine from the proprietor's carefully maintained cellar, conducted conversations that mixed business with pleasure in ways that made the club valuable beyond its gaming function. After dinner, patrons moved upstairs to the gaming rooms, where the night's serious action would occur. The atmosphere was controlled but charged. These were men accustomed to winning, to controlling outcomes, to making decisions that others followed. The gambling gave them opportunity to exercise those instincts in pure form, stripped of the complexity that characterized their business dealings. Bet. Win or lose, bet again. The simplicity was intoxicating. The stakes made it meaningful. One patron in particular, a financier whose recent successes had been documented in financial press, whose name was synonymous with profitable timing and bold decisions, arrived with visible confidence and capital to back it. He began playing at a private table, stakes higher than most others in the room, but not unusual for someone of his wealth. His play was aggressive, the kind of strategy that works brilliantly when luck runs favorably and collapses catastrophically when it does not. For the first hour, luck ran favorably. He won repeatedly, building stacks of chips that represented sums most of the staff would never earn in lifetimes of work. His confidence grew with each win. He increased his bets, pushed harder, treated the table as he treated his business dealings, assuming that boldness would be rewarded, that his instincts would prove correct, that the same intelligence that had made him successful in finance would translate to cards. Then the luck turned. Not dramatically at first, a few losses that seemed like normal variance, temporary setbacks that would reverse. But they didn't reverse. He lost back what he had won, then lost more, then lost sums that began to represent significant portions of his actual wealth rather than just the evening's stakes. Other patrons noticed, staff noticed, the proprietor noticed. The man's expression shifted from confidence to concentration to something approaching desperation. But he could not stop. Stopping would mean acknowledging the loss. And so he continued, betting larger amounts to recover faster, falling into the classic trap of chasing losses with escalating bets that only accelerated his destruction. The painting above his table, a landscape by a French master, properly authenticated, worth a fortune in its own right, looked down on this process with the indifference of art that outlasts the people who create and collect and lose it. The irony was almost too perfect. The man ruining himself financially in a room designed to make ruin feel cultured, gambling beneath artwork worth more than some of the sums he was losing, experiencing catastrophe in surroundings so beautiful that the catastrophe seemed like sophisticated misfortune rather than what it was. By evening's end, he had lost an amount equivalent to what many families might earn in a generation. Lost it over several hours of play in a room designed to make such losses feel acceptable. When he finally stood from the table, not because he had decided to stop, but because his credit was exhausted and he could not continue, his expression showed recognition of what had happened. But he performed the ritual expected of him, thanked the house, spoke with other patrons as if the evening had been enjoyable rather than devastating, departed through the main entrance with posture that suggested composure rather than ruin. The proprietor watched this departure with mixed feelings. The evening had been profitable for the house, extraordinarily so, but it had also been excessive in ways that created risk. The man who had lost so heavily was known publicly, had family and business associates who would notice financial strain, might ask questions that would make his losses less private than both he and the club needed them to be. The win for the house was real, but so was the danger, the seed of destruction that every peak contains. The other patrons departed over the following hours, their own evenings profitable or not, none quite matching the drama of the major loss, but all participants in the system that had made it possible. The staff cleaned and prepared the rooms for the next evening's operation. The money was counted and secured, and the artwork remained on the walls, unchanged by what it had witnessed, ready to perform the same function tomorrow that it had performed tonight. Making vice look like culture, making gambling look like gallery attendance, making ruin look like sophisticated recreation. The luxury had worked perfectly, but perfection, at this scale and with these stakes, could not be sustained indefinitely. The enemy emerged not as a single antagonist, but as a wave of reform energy that had been building for years and finally found focus. Progressive politicians had been gaining strength, campaigning on platforms that promised to clean up corruption, to enforce laws that protected connected vice operators, to break the relationship between political machines and illegal enterprises. For years, these reformers had been dismissed as idealists who would accommodate reality once in office, who would recognize that certain arrangements served functions and provided revenue that government needed. But a new generation of reform prosecutors took office with genuine intent to deliver on campaign promises, willing to sacrifice political capital to make examples of protected operations. The press played a critical role. Newspapers that had previously ignored or minimized stories about illegal gambling began covering it with intensity that made silence impossible. Investigative reporters documented relationships between political officials and vice operators, published estimates of protection payments, identified specific clubs and their prominent patrons. The coverage created public pressure that made continued protection politically costly. Officials, who had been comfortable looking away when operations were invisible, became vulnerable to accusations of corruption when the operations were front-page news. The first visible crack appeared when a political figure who had been key to the protection network lost an election to a reform candidate. The defeat signaled that political winds had shifted, that relationships that had seemed secure were actually dependent on electoral outcomes beyond any single operator's control. The proprietor understood immediately that his network of protection had weakened, that the arrangements he had maintained for years might not survive the political transition. He attempted to adapt, increased payments to officials who remained in power, hoping to reinforce relationships that might be tested, reduced the club's profile, hosting fewer and smaller events, trying to become less visible target, enhanced security procedures, preparing for possibility of raids or investigations. But these defensive measures revealed anxiety that patrons noticed. The club that had felt permanent began to feel provisional, and men whose presence depended on assumption of immunity became nervous about continued patronage. Then came the investigation. A reform prosecutor, newly elected on platform of enforcing gambling laws without favoritism, announced he would target elite establishments that had operated with impunity. He subpoenaed financial records from banks, interviewed staff from competing establishments who provided information about how the system worked, built a case designed not just to close specific clubs, but to expose the entire network of protection and corruption that made them possible. The investigation created paranoia among patrons. Men who had attended the club regularly stopped coming, afraid their presence might be documented, that they might be called as witnesses, that their participation would be exposed in ways that damaged reputations and careers. Some sent messages terminating their memberships. Others simply stopped appearing without explanation. The club's essential product, the ability to gamble without social consequence, evaporated once the threat of consequences became real. Staff became unreliable. Some departed for safer employment before the collapse came. Others, approached by investigators, provided information in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the operation for years broke under pressure that made silence less valuable than cooperation. Former dealers described the operation's mechanics. Ex-doormen identified patrons who had frequented the club. A bookkeeper produced records the proprietor had believed destroyed. The proprietor considered options that all looked bad. He could close voluntarily, which would abandon the investment he had made in building the operation, but might reduce legal consequences. He could attempt to relocate, finding new premises and rebuilding protection networks, but the political environment made that unlikely to succeed. He could fight legally, using lawyers to challenge the investigation and protect himself from prosecution, but doing so would create exactly the public records and testimony he had spent years avoiding. The decision was made for him. On an evening when the club was operating with reduced attendance, a dozen patrons, where there had once been scores, the raid came. Not the subtle investigations he had prepared for, but a coordinated action designed to be visible and undeniable. Police blocked exits. Prosecutors arrived with warrants. Photographers captured images that would appear in newspapers. The private world became spectacularly public. The luxury that had disguised vice for years suddenly became evidence of exactly how elaborate the vice had been. The collapse moved through stages that systematically dismantled everything the proprietor had built. The raid itself was surgical. Police knew the building's layout, informed by former staff, who had described the space in exchange for immunity. They blocked both entrances before announcing their presence, ensuring no patrons could depart before being identified. The patrons present that evening, caught mid-game in rooms designed to make gambling feel cultured, faced the exposure they had paid premium prices to avoid. Their names were recorded. Their presence became part of the public record. Some attempted to claim they were simply dining and had not known gambling was occurring, but the chips in front of them and the cards in their hands made those claims absurd. The proprietor was arrested on multiple charges: operating illegal gambling establishment, corrupting public morals, conspiracy, charges related to the protection payments that investigators had documented. The bail was set deliberately high, designed to keep him detained while prosecutors built their case. The newspaper coverage was extensive. Dailies ran front-page stories about the raid, the prominent patrons who had been present, the artwork that had decorated rooms where illegal gambling occurred. The operation that had survived through invisibility was now the most visible scandal in the city. The trial that followed was less about determining guilt, the evidence was overwhelming, than about exposing the system that had protected the operation. Prosecutors called witnesses who described how protection payments worked, which officials had received money, how the network of corruption had functioned. Former staff testified about the club's operations with detail that made clear this was not casual card playing, but systematic gambling operation, generating substantial illegal revenue. The proprietor's lawyers tried to argue that he had believed the operation was legal, that he had relied on assurances from officials who had accepted his payments, but these defenses only documented the corruption rather than excusing it. The conviction came with a sentence designed to send message: imprisonment, substantial fines, permanent prohibition from operating any business involving gambling or alcohol. The proprietor, who had built an operation that seemed untouchable, was removed from the system entirely, made example of to demonstrate that reform was real and protection was no longer reliable. But the fate of the building and its contents revealed the operation's final irony. The property was seized to satisfy the fines and judgments against the proprietor. The contents were inventoried for auction furnishings, equipment, and most valuably, the art collection that had been the operation's defining feature. The paintings that had disguised gambling as culture were sold to legitimate collectors and museums, dispersed to institutions that valued them for their beauty, without examining too closely how a gambling operator had acquired works of such quality. The auction catalog described the pieces with scholarly attention: provenance, condition, artistic significance. It mentioned they came from a private collection, without specifying what that private collection had been. Museums that acquired pieces included them in exhibitions with labels that noted previous ownership, but not previous use. The art survived the operation's collapse, found new homes in galleries where it would be appreciated purely for aesthetic value rather than for the cover it had provided. The building itself was sold to new owners who converted it to legitimate use offices or residential space. The records are unclear. The interior was gutted and rebuilt, removing the rooms where gambling had occurred, erasing the atmosphere that had made illegal activity feel acceptable. Within a few years, nothing visible remained of the club's existence. The address was the same, but what stood there bore no trace of what it had been. The patrons whose presence had been documented mostly escaped consequences. A few suffered social embarrassment or professional damage, but most weathered the exposure through connections and the passage of time. Some claimed they had been victims of the operation rather than willing participants. Others simply stopped discussing the matter, counting on discretion from peers who had their own reasons to let the scandal fade. Within a generation, most people in the city had forgotten or never knew that a particular address had housed an operation that combined illegal gambling with museum-quality art. What was protected, ultimately, was the art itself and the reputations of the most powerful patrons. What was sacrificed was the proprietor, the staff who lost employment, and the clarity about what the operation had actually been. The luxury survived. The people who created and maintained it did not. Walk past the address today, and you will see a building that bears no obvious relationship to what once occurred there. The structure has been renovated, repurposed, perhaps rebuilt entirely. The research is difficult because records about the club were deliberately obscured, names were changed or omitted from official histories, and survivors had reasons to let the story fade. The physical site offers no plaques, no markers, no acknowledgement that this was once a place where fortunes changed hands beneath masterworks from Europe, where illegal gambling operated disguised as cultural gathering. The evidence that survives is scattered and indirect. The trial transcripts exist in archives, documenting the operation's mechanics and the protection network that enabled it. Newspaper accounts from the period describe the raid and the scandal, though with details that have become harder to verify as witnesses died and memories faded. Auction records show the dispersal of the art collection, listing pieces and prices, but rarely explaining what the collection had been assembled to accomplish. And the artworks themselves survive in museums and private collections, hanging on walls in institutions that acquired them legitimately, displayed with scholarly labels that trace their history through previous owners, without dwelling on what those owners did or why they possessed museum-quality pieces. A landscape hangs in one gallery, a portrait in another, a still life in a third scattered remnants of a collection that once served purpose, its current custodians prefer not to examine closely. Art historians who have researched the period know the story, or versions of it. They note in footnotes that certain works passed through the hands of a gambling operator before entering legitimate collections. But this history is treated as curiosity rather than complication, as biographical detail about objects rather than as question about the institutions that now hold them. The paintings are valued for what they are, works by recognized artists, properly authenticated, aesthetically significant, not for what they once did. The fundamental question goes largely unasked in the spaces where these works now hang. When art is used as camouflage for vice, does it still elevate culture, or does it only legitimize the vice? Does beauty deployed strategically to make illegal activity feel acceptable retain its beauty when separated from that context? And when institutions acquire such works through legitimate channels, having passed through auctions and dealers who obscured their origins, do those institutions bear any responsibility for examining how the works were originally assembled? The museums would argue they do not. They purchased or received works legitimately. They display them in service of public education and aesthetic appreciation. What previous owners did with the paintings before they entered collections is historical footnote, not moral complication. The works survived and are now accessible to public, rather than hidden in private club. Surely that is improvement worth celebrating, rather than questioning. But stand in front of one of these paintings, knowing its history, and the questions persist. This landscape that looks so peaceful once hung above a table where men ruined themselves financially. This portrait that seems so dignified once provided cover for an operation that exploited compulsive gambling while claiming to offer sophisticated entertainment. The beauty is real, but so is the history. And history that is convenient to forget is precisely the history that should be remembered. If the collection survives but the place is erased, what does history remember? Beauty or the money it hid? The museums remember beauty. The archives remember scandal. But the complete story. How luxury was weaponized. How art was deployed as infrastructure for vice. How culture and corruption intertwined so thoroughly that separating them required destruction of the operation while preserving the objects. That story exists in fragments that require effort to assemble. And how often does refinement become the perfect mask for vice? More often than institutions want to acknowledge. The club was not unique in using beauty to disguise illegality, in creating environments where wealthy men could indulge prohibited behaviors while feeling cultured rather than corrupt. It was simply more successful than most, more sophisticated in its execution, more thorough in its transformation of vice into something that looked like culture. The lesson, if there is one, is not that art can be corrupted by association with illegal activity. Art is indifferent to the uses it serves. The lesson is that luxury can make anything feel acceptable, that beauty can disguise exploitation, that culture can be performed in service of corruption. The club proved this conclusively, and the art that now hangs in museums, stripped of context and history, continues to prove it through the silence that surrounds its origins. The gallery where fortunes disappeared is gone, but the paintings remain, beautiful and mute, hanging on walls that will never mention what those paintings once witnessed, or what they made possible simply by being there.